Attention, brave souls. What you're about to witness might make your heart race. Before the suspense takes over your screen, click subscribe now and hit the like button. Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. But be warned, only the boldest will survive until the end.
My name is Jason Caldwell. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a wildlife photographer. I've spent years chasing the perfect shot. Grizzly bears fishing in Alaskan rivers, birds taking flight against golden sunsets. The kind of images that remind people how vast and untamed the world still is. But what I'm about to tell you, this isn't about nature's beauty. It's about something that still haunts me, something I wish I could forget. I was deep in the Appalachian Mountains when it happened. It was late October 2020, and the forest was an explosion of reds and golds, the kind of scenery that begged to be captured. I'd driven hours from the nearest town and hiked another 5 miles into the wilderness to find the perfect spot. No people, no noise, just me and the silence of the woods. At least, that's what I thought. The first day was uneventful. I set up my camp near a clearing, the canopy above me broken just enough to catch the sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest was alive, full of birdsong and the rustling of squirrels darting across the forest floor. I spent hours setting up my gear, finding the right angles, and losing myself in the work. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the atmosphere changed. The vibrant forest seemed to grow darker, the trees pressing in like silent sentinels. The air turned colder, sharper, and the usual sounds of the woods began to fade. It was subtle at first, just the absence of birdsong, the lack of movement in the underbrush. I brushed it off, telling myself that nightfall had a way of quieting things down. Then I heard a faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, my camera clutched in my hands, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone, or something, was moving just beyond the edge of my camp. My first thought was a bear. I'd dealt with them before and knew how to handle myself, but this felt different. It wasn't the heavy, lumbering steps of a bear. It was quieter, more measured. "Hello," I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint glint of my camera's tripod standing in the clearing. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer startled by my presence. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke early, eager to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest seemed normal again, alive with the sounds of birds and the distant call of a hawk. I packed my gear and ventured deeper into the woods, following a trail that seemed barely touched by human feet. That's when I found it. At first, I thought it was just a mound of dirt, the kind you'd expect from a fallen tree or a burrowing animal. But as I got closer, I noticed how out of place it looked. Too perfectly shaped, too deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to examine it. The earth was loose, recently disturbed, and a faint, metallic smell lingered in the air. Then I saw it, a hand, pale and mottled, sticking out from the soil like it was reaching for the surface. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting in knots. The fingers were stiff, the nails caked with dirt, as if whoever it belongs to had been trying to claw their way out. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at, to make sense of the impossible. Then the rustling started again, louder this time, coming from the trees to my left. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my camera and started taking photos of the grave, proof of what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the lens steady. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I needed evidence. I needed to show someone. The rustling grew closer, branches snapping underfoot, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just watching me. It was getting closer. The morning air was crisp, the kind that nipped at your skin, just enough to wake you up fully. But there was an unnatural stillness hanging over the forest. the kind that gets under your skin. Even the birds seemed to know something I didn't, because their songs had vanished overnight. I packed my gear, forcing myself to believe that everything was fine. Just another day out in the wild. Just another shoot. I told myself the noises from the night before, the faint snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves, were nothing. Animals, maybe the wind. But deep down I knew better. Someone, or something, had been near my camp, close enough to hear my breathing if they wanted to. I set out along a trail, camera slung over my shoulder, but the sensation of being watched clung to me like a second shadow. My trail cameras were placed strategically the day before, and retrieving them became my first priority. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if there really was someone out here with me. The first camera was fine, untouched. Its memory card revealed nothing unusual, just the faint blur of leaves swaying in the wind. I exhaled, almost laughing at my paranoia. But when I got to the second camera, that laugh died in my throat. It was tilted down, almost ripped from the tree it was strapped to. My stomach sank as I pulled the card and reviewed the footage. At first, it was the same, static shots of the forest. But then came the frames. Out of focus at first, then clearer a figure. Humanoid, standing just on the edge of the frame, watching the camera. Watching me. My fingers trembled as I skipped through the images, but the figure never moved closer. It just lingered, half hidden by the trees, its face obscured. I packed up the camera, my heart thundering in my chest, and told myself I needed to head back to town. Whatever this was, it was bigger than me. I wasn't prepared to handle it alone. On the way down, I ran into a man. A local by the looks of him, weathered and wary, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He stood by the edge of the trail, leaning on a stick like he'd been waiting. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice rough and low, like gravel scraping in his throat. I forced a polite smile. "Just passing through. I'll be heading out soon." His gaze didn't waver. "Not soon enough. People go missing out here, you know. They think it's the bears or the coyotes, but it ain't." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but something about the way he said it made my mouth dry. He muttered something under his breath, shook his head, and walked away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should, like the forest itself was amplifying my presence. I reached my camp by late afternoon, and my stomach churned. It had been ransacked. My tent was slashed, my gear scattered. Food I'd left sealed was spilled across the ground, but it wasn't eaten. It wasn't animals. This was deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I picked a torn piece of my sleeping bag. Then I saw it, a message carved into the nearest tree. The letters were jagged, uneven, but the message was clear. LEAV. My breath caught in my throat. The knife marks were fresh. Whoever had done this hadn't gone far. I wanted to scream, to run, but where? The road back to town was miles away, and now it felt like the forest itself had turned against me. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, and the trees stood closer together than before, like a labyrinth slowly tightening its grip. I stayed awake that night, clutching a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other, as the sounds began again. The snapping twigs, the faint rustle of leaves, and, just before dawn, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps circling my camp. Whoever it was, they didn't come closer, but they wanted me to know they were there, and they weren't going to stop. The forest had never felt so alive, yet so suffocating. Every branch seemed to reach for me. Every gust of wind whispered warnings I didn't want to hear. My lungs burned as I moved deeper into the wilderness, my instincts screaming that I wasn't alone. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Not after what I had seen. I had stumbled across a clearing earlier, a place that felt unnatural wrong. There, in the heart of the forest, I found it, a campsite that didn't belong. No tent, no fire pit, just the remnants of lives that had passed through this place and never left. Personal items were scattered like offerings, a cracked cell phone, a tattered scarf, a faded photograph of a smiling family. but it was the arrangement that struck me, a grim display of power and control. Items hung from trees by fishing line, swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking me. A rusted knife stabbed into the base of a tree trunk bore dried blood, its blade reflecting the faint light filtering through the canopy. And then I saw a badge. A police badge, scratched and tarnished, sitting atop a pile of shredded fabric that once might have been a uniform. My breath hitched. Someone had been here to investigate before me. Someone who didn't make it out. The weight of realization sank into my chest, cold and heavy. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaos. Someone, no something, had made this their domain, and I had wandered straight into it. I backed away, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. That's when I heard it, a crack, faint but deliberate, the sound of a footfall just behind me. I froze, every muscle locking in place as my mind screamed at me to run. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the shadows. Nothing. Just the endless forest, but I wasn't alone. The feeling was undeniable, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my skin. My pulse quickened, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I reached for my tripod, gripping it like a lifeline. My camera had been my tool, my weapon of choice against the unpredictable wild. Now, it felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever was out there. The forest came alive with sounds. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant whispers of something moving with purpose. The stalker was here, watching me, waiting. I couldn't stay in the clearing. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. I ducked into the tree line, waving through the dense underbrush, my steps careful but hurried. My mind raced, calculating my every move. I needed a plan. A sudden noise erupted behind me, sharp and loud, a branch snapping underfoot. It was close, too close. I spun around, gripping the tripod like a weapon, but the forest was empty again. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. And then, I saw them, eyes, just for a moment, glinting in the dim light before vanishing into the shadows. My chest tightened. They weren't hiding. They were toying with me. I had to fight back. My mind sharpened, instincts kicking in. I set up the camera on the tripod, angling it toward the direction of the movement. With trembling hands, I rigged the flash to trigger manually. If they came closer, I'd blind them. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I crouched low, gripping a jagged piece of the broken tripod leg in one hand and the flash trigger in the other. Minutes passed like hours, the forest eerily quiet now, the calm before the storm. Then, a shadow moved. Fast, deliberate, I pressed the trigger. The flash exploded, lighting up the forest in a blinding white burst. For a split second, I saw them. Tall, lean, face obscured by a crude mask. They froze, startled, before vanishing into the darkness again. Adrenaline surged through me, my fear eclipsed by raw survival instinct. I couldn't let them control this game. I moved quickly, setting up more distractions, triggering flashes in different directions, throwing rocks to create noise, anything to disorient them. But they were relentless. Their movements grew bolder, closer. The chase had begun in earnest. I ran, my legs screaming in protest as branches clawed at my skin. The ground was uneven, every step a risk of twisting an ankle or worse. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps measured, unhurried. They weren't chasing to catch me. They were chasing to tire me out. My vision blurred with exhaustion, but I pushed forward, driven by sheer will. Finally, I saw it, a break in the trees ahead, the faint outline of a road. Safety. But they weren't going to let me go that easily. A low whistle cut through the air, haunting and sharp. It was a signal, a warning. They were close, too close. I turned, gripping the broken tripod like a weapon, ready for a final stand. The shadow emerged, slow and deliberate, the mask catching the faint light. "Why?" I shouted, my voice hoarse and raw. "What do you want from me?" They didn't answer. They just stood there, head tilted slightly, as if studying me. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken menace, until they lunged. Time slowed. I swung the tripod with everything I had, the jagged edge connecting with a sickening thud. They staggered, falling to one knee, and I didn't wait to see if they'd recover. I ran, every ounce of strength focused on getting to that road. When I finally burst out of the forest and onto the pavement, I collapsed. The headlights of a truck blinded me, its horn blaring as it screeched to a stop. I was safe. For now. But as I was pulled into the truck's cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Somewhere, deep in that forest, the stalker was still watching, still waiting, and I had barely escaped with my life. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a deafening thud that echoed louder than the snapping twigs under my feet. The forest seemed alive, its dark tendrils of shadow reaching for me, as if it were in league with him, the stalker. Every step felt like a betrayal, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots signaling my position as clearly as a gunshot. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop now. The tripod in my hand felt useless, a fragile weapon against the predator who had been toying with me for hours. Or was it days? Time had lost meaning here. All I knew was the smell of damp earth, the bite of cold air, and the oppressive weight of being hunted. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see his silhouette lurking just beyond the gnarled trees. But the forest revealed nothing, only silence. That was worse than noise. Silence meant he was waiting. I stumbled upon a clearing, the moonlight painting a pale spotlight on the ground ahead. It felt like a trap, an invitation I couldn't refuse. My leg throbbed, the makeshift bandage around my calf sticky with blood. I was leaving a trail, a breadcrumb path for the stalker to follow. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to get out of this place. But there was nowhere to go. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth designed to swallow me whole. And then I heard it, a soft crunch, deliberate, close. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, gripping the tripod tighter. The shadows shifted, and he emerged, slowly, confidently, as if savoring the moment. He wore a tattered jacket, his face obscured by the low brim of a hat, but it was his eyes that struck me. Cold, calculating, they glinted in the moonlight like those of a wolf, studying its prey. "You good," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to speaking. "Most don't make it this far." I didn't respond. What could I say? My mouth was dry, my thoughts scrambled. Instead, I backed away, keeping the tripod between us like a flimsy shield. He took a step forward, closing the distance with terrifying ease. "Found my campsite, didn't you?" he continued, almost conversationally. "Most people run the other way when they see what's inside. But not you. You're curious. That's gonna get you killed." My grip on the tripod tightened. I needed to think. Fast. He was bigger, stronger, and far more familiar with this terrain. My only advantage was the element of surprise, and even that felt laughably thin. "You don't have to do this," I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. "You can walk away." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Walk away. This is my home. You're the one trespassing." Before I could react, he lunged. I swung the tripod with every ounce of strength I had left, the jagged end catching him across the arm. He hissed in pain, but didn't stop, grabbing the tripod and yanking it from my hands. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. The wind was knocked out of me, but I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline overriding the pain. He was on me again, his movements swift and precise. I dodged to the side, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging wildly. It connected with his shoulder, and he staggered, giving me a brief window. I didn't think, I just ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I tore through the forest, blind to everything except the need to escape. My lungs burned, my injured leg screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sounds of pursuit were all around me, the stalker moving with an animalistic grace that made it impossible to pinpoint his location. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom in the dark. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. A road, salvation. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the searing pain, the dizziness threatening to overtake me. The light grew brighter, and then I was there, collapsing onto the asphalt as a pair of headlights blinded me. The truck screeched to a halt, the driver jumping out and shouting something I couldn't hear over the roar of blood in my ears. I tried to speak, to warn them, but my body betrayed me, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint as unconsciousness dragged me under. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest. A police officer sat beside me, his expression grim as he explained what they had found. Or rather, what they hadn't. The graves were real, just as I'd described, but the stalker, he was gone, vanished like smoke into the wind. They promised to keep searching, but I knew the truth. He was still out there, watching, waiting for his next prey, and though I'd escaped, a part of me would always remain in that forest, haunted by the shadows and the man who hunted them.